Many people choose to relocate. Sometimes a good job offer means you need to move to a different area. Other times, family needs can only be met in a different location, or you might just want a change of scenery. There are a variety of reasons to relocate, and most of the time the move is based on your own choices. Sometimes, though, the relocation is forced. In the annals of Soviet history, Nazino Island stands as a chilling testament to the brutality of Stalin's regime. That remote spot in western Siberia became the site of an unimaginable tragedy in 1933, earning it the grim nickname Cannibal Island. What transpired there remains one of the most horrific yet lesser-known chapters of 20th century history. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union embarked on a massive social engineering project that would lead to one of the darkest chapters in its history. The idea was to spread out the population and make use of the vast untapped farmland across the country. In February of 1933, Genrikh Yagoda, head of the OGPU secret police, and Matvey Berman, head of the Gulag labor camp system, proposed an ambitious plan to Joseph Stalin. At the time, Stalin was the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and pretty much had supreme control of the country, though he wasn't head of government yet. He would go on to become the premier and ultimately the dictator of the Soviet Union in 1941. In the early 1930s, though, his policies created a major famine and government officials were trying to come up with a way of increasing food production. Their vision was to resettle up to 2 million people in the remote reaches of Siberia and Soviet Kazakhstan. The goal, to bring over 1 million hectares or 2.5 million acres of virgin land into production and establish self-sufficient communities within 2 years. The plan was not just about agricultural development. It also served as a way to cover up the ongoing famine in Ukraine and other parts of the country. The project targeted a number of specific groups of people, and first it's important to describe what a kulak was. A kulak was a peasant who owned more than 3 hectares or 7.5 acres of land. They were considered by some to be quote-unquote almost wealthy with larger, successful farms. In 1917, the Soviet government had begun a campaign of dekulakization in which they arrested, deported, or executed millions of kulaks and their families. Officials claimed that the campaign was intended to fight counter-revolutionary efforts and to build socialism in the countryside. The groups that were targeted for relocation were kulaks who had not been dekulakized yet, peasants who were allegedly working against the state, people from agricultural areas in the Western Soviet territories, and urban undesirables. The authorities saw it as an opportunity to cleanse major cities of what they deemed superfluous elements not connected with production or administrative work. To facilitate the massive resettlement plan, the Soviet government reinstated a system that had been abolished after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution: internal passports. That move, reminiscent of Tsarist Russia, proved to be a powerful tool for identifying and controlling the population. The Passportization campaign began with a decision from the highest level of the Communist political party called the Politburo on December 27, 1932. Its primary objective was to issue internal passports to residents of major cities like Moscow and Leningrad. However, the system had a sinister purpose: to identify and remove undesirable elements from urban centers. Those who didn't fit the idealized worker class structure found themselves in a precarious position. Former merchants, traders, peasants fleeing famine, petty criminals, and anyone else deemed socially harmful were denied passports. Without that crucial document, those individuals became easy targets for arrest and deportation. The process of deportation was swift and merciless. Police throughout the country began rounding up anyone found in a place other than where they were registered. Many were arrested for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One young man recounted being detained while visiting his aunt in Moscow simply because he didn't have his passport with him. Between March and July of 1933, the authorities arrested and deported 85,937 people from Moscow and 4,776 from Leningrad due to lack of passports. Most arrestees were deported within 2 days, leaving them no time to prepare or say goodbye to their families. The journey to their new homes was harrowing. Rail convoys departed from Moscow and Leningrad on April 29th and 30th, 1933, respectively. The deportees were crammed into train carriages and given meager rations of just 300 grams of bread per day. Many went without food as thuggery within the carriages meant those with muscle and questionable morals took more than their share. In Tomsk, a transit camp had been built 3 years earlier, but it had been unused and most of the huts that had been built were in such bad shape they couldn't be used. In March, officials visited the site and reported that the camp was in bad shape and they would need to build new huts as well as some temporary tents to house all of the deportees that would be coming through the camp. It was advised that the deportees not arrive at the camp before May 8th, but housing wasn't the only problem. The camp had also not received any of the grain they were supposed to get to feed the deportees while they were there. They had not received a government voucher for the first 20,000 metric tons of grain they were scheduled to get, and the second shipment they would need was never scheduled. Despite all of that, deportees started arriving at the camp on April 9th, a month before the camp was scheduled to be ready. Not only was the camp not ready, but they couldn't move anybody out of the camp because the last leg of the trip was supposed to take place on barges down a river that was still frozen. By April 30th, more than 25,000 deportees had arrived at the camp, which was not prepared to hold them and not able to move them to their final destination. 1/3 of them were classified as socially dangerous elements. The convoys all arrived in Tomsk with a number of dead passengers. The rest were emaciated from receiving only 300 grams of bread per day, and most were infested with lice since no personal hygiene was offered on the trip. In the second half of April, more than 500 people in the camp died. It wasn't until May 14th that deportees were finally able to be sent from the camp to the areas where they were supposed to be settling a new community. After the long train journey and the stay at the transit camp, the deportees were transferred to barges and sent down the Ob River. For 2 weeks, they were packed together like sardines, their daily rations reduced to a mere 200 grams of bread. The conditions were so dire that 27 people died before ever reaching the island. Having made it through the torturous and unorganized transportation to their new home, the deportees were likely relieved when they finally made it. Unfortunately, that relief would be short-lived. Thousands of unprepared quote-unquote settlers were about to be offloaded onto a remote island, setting the stage for one of the most horrific episodes in Soviet history. The barges that were supposed to take the deportees to their final locations were delayed. Then there was the matter of finding enough guards to accompany the exiled individuals. They wanted to have 1 guard for every 100 deportees, and finding 50 professional guards for the trip to Nazino would have been impossible. Instead, the officials recruited poor unemployed men who they found wandering around Tomsk. Most of them were tricked into going along with promises that would never be kept. They were not provided with any type of uniform, so it was hard to tell who was a guard and who wasn't. That made their authority easy to ignore, which only led to problems. Some of the guards were armed with old rifles, and so they were able to use the threat of violence to extort anything they could from the deportees, which wasn't much. On May 18, 1933, a flotilla of barges arrived at Nazino Island, bringing with them 4,556 men and 322 women. The island, a mere 1.8 miles or 3 kilometers long and 1/3 of a mile or 600 meters wide, was a swampy strip of land in the middle of the Ob River, and offered no shelter, no buildings, and no facilities of any kind. The Soviet authorities had provided a woefully inadequate supply of food, just 20 tons of raw flour for nearly 5,000 people. That meager provision would prove to be both a lifeline and a source of conflict during the deportees' time in exile. Once at the island, over a third of the survivors were too weak to even stand. The area was not supposed to receive relocated residents until the end of June, so no supplies had been delivered to the island. It wasn't that there weren't any facilities to use for shelter, there weren't any supplies to even build them. Without tools or materials to construct even basic shelters, the deportees were left completely vulnerable to the brutal Siberian weather. The first night on the island saw 295 people buried, and by May 21st, just 3 days after arrival, 70 new deaths were recorded with disturbing signs of cannibalism seen in 5 cases. There were no extra clothes, and most importantly, there was no way to cook food or access clean water. The people who were supposed to create a functioning society on this remote island had absolutely no means of doing that. Attempts to unload the flour quickly descended into chaos. Riots broke out, leading to more deaths as guards fired on the residents to restore order. The person in charge ended up having the flour unloaded on the other side of the river in the little village of Nazino. The situation only worsened as time went on. One survivor recounted, quote, "Immediately after the snow and frost came the rains and freezing winds, and the people were still left without food. The lack of proper nutrition quickly became a critical issue. For the first 4 days after arrival, no food was distributed at all. When the officials finally started distributing the flour, the fact that none of the residents had any belongings became a problem. What were they supposed to put the flour in? What were they supposed to cook it in? Nobody had a cup or a pot. Some were able to use their hat or a shoe, but many just had to carry it in their hands. From there, the raw flour was distributed every 4th or 5th day in meager rations of a few hundred grams per person. Desperate with hunger, many deportees resorted to eating the flour raw. That led to tragic consequences as some suffocated from inhaling the powder. Others mixed the flour with dirty river water, leading to an outbreak of dysentery that would further weaken the already fragile population. The death toll continued to rise at an alarming rate, driven by a lethal combination of starvation, disease, and violence. Despite the immediate problems on the island, an additional group of deportees was sent to Nazino. They were sent out before the officials in the first group had returned, so the transit camp in Tomsk was unaware of the situation. The additional 1,200 people arrived on the island on May 27th, and that brought the population of the doomed community to about 6,000. As resources dwindled and desperation grew, the situation spiraled out of control. Every time flour was distributed, the situation would devolve into a riot, with many residents getting trampled. Because of that, the leader began distributing larger quantities of flour to a few people who were then supposed to hand it out to others. Of course, there was a decent population of criminals within the exiled group, so that new system just encouraged some people to take advantage. On top of that, gangs formed, terrorizing weaker settlers and fighting over the scarce food and valuables. Murder became commonplace, with bodies often looted for anything of value, including gold tooth fillings which could be exchanged for food or cigarettes with the men who were guarding the camp. Eventually, more food was brought in, but it was still limited and it was being controlled by gangs and guards. They would eventually have loaves of bread, soup, and saltfish. The officials believed that the island was inescapable. The river's current was strong and the water was freezing. The deportees didn't have any tools to use to build boats, but there were people who were able to tie large branches together to make rafts. Most drowned in the attempt, while those who managed to reach the shore were hunted down by guards as if it were sport. The surrounding wilderness, harsh and unforgiving, claimed the lives of those few who managed to evade capture. The most horrific development on the island was the spread of cannibalism. The first account of cannibalism was noted just a few days after the deportees arrived. The group had 2 health officers with them, apparently in an effort to help them survive. On May 21st, the health officers had recorded 70 deaths, but the largest part of their report was about the 5 bodies that showed signs of cannibalism. In their report, they wrote, quote, The liver, the heart, the lungs, and fleshy parts of the bodies, breasts, calves, had been cut off. On one of the bodies, the head had been torn off along with the male genital organs and part of the skin. These mutilations constitute strong evidence of cannibalistic acts. In addition, they suggest the existence of serious psychopathologies. On the same day, May 21st, the deportees themselves brought us 3 individuals who had been caught with blood on their hands and holding human livers. Our examination of these 3 individuals did not reveal any extreme emaciation, but rather external signs of degeneracy. These individuals were immediately turned over to the head of the guard. Over the next few weeks, the health officers documented 3 more cases of bodies having their internal organs and flesh removed. The guards didn't do anything to the accused as they had no evidence that they had killed the person they were eventually eating. That seemed to be how the cannibalism started. Hungry deportees taking advantage of the recently deceased in order to save themselves. But it wasn't long before that wasn't enough. One prisoner named Uglov later testified during interrogations, quote, "I was choosing those who were no longer alive, but not yet dead either. You could see that a person was a goner, that they would die anyway in a day or 2. So it would be easier for them to die now, right away, instead of suffering for 2 or 3 more days." The escalation from scavenging an already dead person to putting a person who was about to die out of their misery quickly escalated further into full-blown murder. By late May, settlers began murdering others solely for the purpose of consuming them. Over the next month, guards arrested about 50 people for cannibalism, though many were released for lack of evidence. Theophila Bailina, a resident of the village of Nazino, shared a chilling encounter. She said, quote, "Once an old woman came from the Death Island. She was being deported further. I saw that the old woman's calves had been cut off. When I asked, she said they were cut off on Death Island and grilled. All the flesh on her calves had been cut off. Her legs were freezing all the time and the woman wrapped them in rags, but she was able to walk unaided. She looked old, but in reality, she was just in her early 40s. Another survivor, when asked if he ate human meat, responded, quote, "No, that is not true. I only ate livers and hearts." He then described the process, saying, quote, "It was very simple, just like shashlik. We made skewers from willow branches, cut it into pieces, stuck it on the skewers, and roasted it over the campfire." The horror of the situation is vividly captured in the testimonies of survivors and witnesses. Residents of nearby villages became unwitting observers to the nightmare unfolding on the island. One particularly disturbing account involves a guard named Kostya Venikov. An eyewitness reported, quote, "He fell in love with a girl who had been sent there and was courting her. He protected her. One day he had to be away for a while and he told one of his comrades to take care of her. But with all the people there, the comrade couldn't do much really." A 13-year-old peasant girl recalled the gruesome scene, saying, quote, "When he left, people grabbed the girl, tied her to a tree and stabbed her to death, eating everything they could. They were hungry and wanted to eat. All over the island, one could see human flesh being ripped, cut, and hung on trees. The clearings were littered with corpses." Despite the story earning the island the nickname Cannibal Island, it's believed that the accounts of cannibalism have been greatly exaggerated over the years. There is no proven account of the actual number of people who resorted to cannibalism on the island, but historians believe that there were 20 to 25 people on the island who committed cannibalism. At the beginning of June, a report was sent to Soviet leadership about Nazino Island, and it detailed the many problems they were facing. Once the report got to the highest political authorities, they demanded an explanation. That would put in motion the gradual removal of the deportees from the island and the attempts by the Soviet government to keep the situation quiet. An inspection team arrived on the island on June 21st, and when the health officers told them that 1,970 people had died, they decided that number was too high for political reasons. Instead, they exhumed the bodies from 3 of the 31 mass graves on the island. Those 3 graves had a total of 82 bodies in them, so using an average for the graves, they determined that about 850 deportees had died. Of course, that didn't take into account the bodies that didn't get buried, such as the people who died trying to escape. Even with the reduced death toll, Soviet authorities finally dissolved the settlement on the island. The surviving 2,856 deportees were transferred to smaller settlements up the river. However, that evacuation didn't mark the end of their ordeal. A staggering 157 people were left behind on the island, too ill to be moved. The transfer itself proved deadly, with several hundred more deportees perishing during the journey. Those who made it to the new settlement found themselves facing similar challenges. With few tools, little food, and an outbreak of typhus, their situation remained dire. The trauma of their experiences on Nazino Island left a lasting impact, with most deportees refusing to work in the new settlement due to their previous treatment. The true extent of the Nazino tragedy became apparent in the following weeks. Of the approximately 6,000 people initially deported to the island, between 1,500 and 2,000 had died due to starvation, exposure, disease, murder, or accidental death in just 13 weeks. Even more alarming, another 2,000 settlers had simply vanished without a trace and were presumed dead. The Soviet authorities made concerted efforts to conceal the horrors of Nazino Island. The island officials' report, which exposed the full extent of the tragedy, was systematically sidelined by the Soviet government. As a consequence of his whistleblowing, he was removed from government employment. Local officials and guards at the island attempted to dispute the report, but their efforts backfired. Instead of successfully covering up the events, they were reprimanded and received prison sentences ranging from 1 to 3 years. The truth about what happened on Nazino Island remained hidden from the general public for decades. It wasn't until the late 1980s, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the full story began to emerge. In 1988, the Soviet Union implemented something called glasnost. It's a concept relating to openness and transparency, and it's the basis for the idea of freedom of information. Glasnost caused the Soviet Union to become more open about its past, allowing the human rights group Russian Memorial Society to investigate and bring the horrors of Nazino Island to public attention. Today, the memory of those who suffered on Cannibal Island is preserved. A wooden cross was planted on the island to commemorate the victims, and every June, pilgrims make their way from Tomsk to pay their respects. In 2018, a church was built and dedicated to the memory of the victims, ensuring this dark chapter of history will not be forgotten. The Nazino Island tragedy stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of totalitarian regimes and misguided social engineering. That dark chapter in Soviet history sheds light on the devastating consequences of forced resettlement, lack of proper planning, and disregard for human life. The horrific events that unfolded on this remote Siberian island have had an impact on our understanding of the lengths to which authoritarian governments can go to enforce their ideologies. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.